Welcome back to Strategic Isomorphism, uncovering parallel logics of power across organizations. I'm Kaede, and if you've been with us for our previous episodes, you'll recall we've explored how remarkably similar control structures emerge across diverse organizations, how economic leverage tactics converge despite radically different contexts, and how strategic partnerships form through parallel logics. Today, we're shifting our focus to what might be the organizational equivalent of family rules, how organizations establish and enforce internal order. In our previous episode on strategic partnerships, we saw how organizations from criminal syndicates to tech platforms form alliances to achieve what they couldn't accomplish alone. Today, we'll examine how these same diverse entities maintain internal governance, essentially discovering that whether you're running a crime family or a corporation, you'll eventually need rules and ways to enforce them, just with different terminology and considerably different consequences for breaking them. Our theoretical frameworks today include social control theory concepts, signaling theory, and institutional perspectives on governance. While acknowledging the profound differences in methods, from violence to legal process, we'll focus on the functional similarities that reveal strategic isomorphism in action. As we discovered with control structures, economic leverage, and alliance formation, these governance mechanisms show remarkable convergence, whether it's the Yakuza enforcing its Jingi code or corporations implementing ethics policies. It's all about establishing norms and ensuring compliance, just with different letterheads on the rule books. Let's begin by examining how diverse organizations establish norms and signal commitment, a universal approach that works whether you're wearing a suit or sporting full-body tattoos. At the core of internal governance across organizational contexts lies the fundamental need for codes and rule systems, frameworks that establish clear expectations for acceptable behavior. It's the organizational equivalent of parents establishing house rules, just with more legalese and occasionally more severe punishments for leaving the metaphorical toilet seat up. The Yakuza operates through Jingi, honor-based codes that establish specific behavioral expectations and values hierarchies that determine which principles take precedence in conflicts. These aren't merely suggestions, but fundamental rules governing everything from respect for superiors to conflict resolution approaches. State legal systems function through similar logic, but with formal authority, creating constitutions that establish foundational principles and regulatory frameworks that govern specific domains. Political party platforms extend this approach through ideological expectations that define acceptable positions and membership requirements that establish behavioral boundaries, essentially codifying what it means to belong to the group and what actions might get you expelled. Corporate governance mirrors these approaches through formal policies that establish operational guidelines, codes of conduct that define ethical boundaries, and compliance frameworks that ensure adherence to both internal rules and external regulations. Digital governance has evolved this model through platform rules that determine acceptable user behavior, terms of service agreements that establish contractual obligations, and content policies that define boundaries for expression. The universal function underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, setting clear expectations for acceptable behavior to reduce uncertainty and create predictable interactions. Implementation variations primarily reflect legitimacy differences rather than functional distinctions. Formal legal documents versus unwritten codes, algorithmic enforcement versus physical punishment, public versus private jurisdiction. But the rule categories remain strikingly similar. Current examples abound in contemporary organizations. ESG, environmental, social, governance, frameworks establishing new behavioral expectations around sustainability and social responsibility, remote work policies defining boundaries between professional and personal spaces, and AI ethics guidelines attempting to govern emerging technological domains. The consistent emergence of these code systems across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action, convergent solutions to the universal challenge of establishing behavioral expectations. Whether you're running a crime syndicate or a corporation, you'll eventually need to write down what people can and cannot do, just with different consequences for breaking the rules. Beyond establishing rules, organizations across contexts require costly signaling and rituals, visible demonstrations of commitment that separate genuine adherence from mere lip service. It's the organizational equivalent of talk is cheap, demanding actions that prove loyalty beyond words alone. The Yakuza's Yubitsum ritual, where members cut off portions of their own fingers to atone for serious mistakes, represents perhaps the most literal example of costly signaling. A permanent, painful demonstration that one values organizational membership above physical wholeness. State ceremonies function through similar logic, but with symbolic rather than physical costs, requiring oaths of office that publicly commit officials to constitutional principles, military rituals that demonstrate willingness to sacrifice for collective goals, and national observances that reinforce shared values through participation costs. Political signaling extends this approach through loyalty demonstrations at rallies and conventions, ideological purity tests that require public adherence to party positions, and symbolic actions that demonstrate commitment to group values. Corporate commitment signals mirror these approaches through investment decisions that allocate resources to strategic priorities, public pledges that create reputational stakes, and symbolic actions that demonstrate values alignment. ESG reporting has emerged as a particularly notable signaling mechanism, with sustainability assurance practices and transparency commitments functioning as costly signals of environmental and social responsibility, essentially saying, "We're so committed to these values that we'll measure and report on them even when the results might be unflattering." The universal signaling logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, demonstrating commitment through actions costly enough that only genuinely committed actors would undertake them. Implementation examples abound in contemporary organizations. Green innovation investments that signal environmental commitment through resource allocation, diversity initiatives that demonstrate inclusion values through hiring and promotion practices, and public stand staking on controversial issues that signals values even at the risk of alienating some stakeholders. Current research indicates organizations with strong symbolic governance are 42% more likely to maintain stakeholder trust during crises, essentially confirming that consistent signaling builds reputational capital that provides resilience when challenges emerge. The consistent emergence of these signaling approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action, convergent solutions to the universal challenge of distinguishing genuine commitment from empty compliance. Whether you're demonstrating loyalty to a crime family or a corporate mission, you'll eventually need to prove your commitment through actions that would be too costly for the uncommitted to fake. Internal conflicts inevitably arise in all organizations, necessitating mediation and adjudication processes that resolve disputes while maintaining order. It's the organizational equivalent of siblings fighting over the last cookie. Someone with authority eventually needs to step in before things escalate to hair-pulling. The Yakuza approaches this challenge through senior leader mediation, where respected figures resolve conflicts between members, and hierarchical dispute resolution processes that escalate issues through the chain of command, when direct resolution fails. State systems function through similar logic, but with formal legal authority, establishing courts that adjudicate disputes according to established laws, administrative tribunals that handle specialized domains, and alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that offer less adversarial options for conflict management. Political mechanisms extend this approach through ethics committees that investigate alleged violations, disciplinary boards that determine consequences for misconduct, and leadership arbitration that resolves conflicts between factions. Corporate processes mirror these approaches through HR procedures that address workplace disputes, ethics hotlines that provide confidential reporting channels, and ombudsman offices that offer neutral third-party mediation. Digital workspace tools have evolved these systems through online reporting mechanisms that standardize complaint processing, algorithmic conflict flagging that identifies potential issues before they escalate, and digital documentation that creates accountability trails. The universal resolution logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, providing structured processes for addressing internal conflicts before they threaten organizational cohesion. Implementation variations primarily reflect legitimacy differences rather than functional distinctions. Formal legal procedures versus informal mediation, extensive procedural rights versus summary judgment, transparent versus confidential processes. But the escalation pathways remain strikingly similar. Current examples reveal ongoing evolution. Remote work environments creating new conflict resolution challenges as interactions move online, cross-cultural teams requiring dispute management, approaches that bridge different expectations, and hybrid organizations developing parallel physical and digital resolution systems. The consistent emergence of these dispute resolution approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal challenge of maintaining internal peace despite inevitable conflicts. Whether you're resolving a territorial dispute between crime families or a resource allocation conflict between departments, you'll eventually need structured processes that prevent disagreements from becoming destructive. The final cornerstone of internal governance manifests through deviant sanctioning systems, frameworks that impose consequences for rule violations to reinforce norms and deter future infractions. It's the organizational equivalent of, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime, making rule-breaking sufficiently costly that compliance becomes the rational choice. The Yakuza employs direct approaches. Ostracism that cuts violators off from group benefits, physical consequences ranging from finger amputation to more severe punishments, and expulsion mechanisms that permanently remove serious offenders from the organization. State penalties function through similar logic, but with legal authority, imposing fines that create economic consequences, imprisonment that restricts freedom, and civil disabilities that limit future opportunities. Political sanctions extend this approach through position loss that removes authority and privileges, public censure that damages reputation, and party expulsion that terminates membership benefits and identity. Corporate discipline mirrors these approaches through progressive systems. Warnings that signal disapproval without immediate consequences, performance improvement plans that create structured rehabilitation opportunities, and termination that permanently removes violators from the organization. Digital enforcement has evolved these mechanisms through automated compliance systems that flag violations without human intervention, algorithmic monitoring that identifies pattern deviations, and digital access restrictions that limit capabilities based on compliance history. The universal enforcement logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, creating consequences for rule violations that reinforce norms and deter future infractions. Implementation variations primarily reflect legitimacy differences rather than functional distinctions. Physical versus economic punishments, summary versus procedural justice, permanent versus temporary consequences, but the graduated response patterns remain strikingly similar. Current research indicates organizations balancing punitive and restorative approaches demonstrate 37% greater effectiveness at maintaining compliance, essentially confirming that the carrot and stick approach works better than the stick alone. The consistent emergence of these sanctioning approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action, convergent solutions to the universal challenge of enforcing rules through consequences. Whether you're maintaining discipline in a criminal organization or a corporation, you'll eventually need to decide what happens to people who break the rules, just with different terminology in the disciplinary documentation. The emergence of environmental, social, and governance ESG reporting between 2015 and 2025 provides a fascinating example of normative governance developing through institutional isomorphism, essentially watching organizations discover that saving the planet can be both a moral imperative and an effective governance mechanism. The timeline reveals rapid evolution. Institutional isomorphism driving standardized reporting practices across industries, labor rights and compensation metrics converging despite different business models, sustainability assurance practices emerging as powerful organizational signaling mechanisms, and December 2024, research confirming mimetic adoption patterns, where organizations copy peers, approaches regardless of demonstrated effectiveness. The parallels to traditional governance are unmistakable. ESG frameworks establish codes through standardized reporting requirements that define acceptable behavior, voluntary disclosure functions as costly signaling that demonstrates commitment beyond regulatory requirements, and measurement creates accountability by making performance visible to stakeholders. What's particularly revealing from an isomorphism perspective is how organizations across different industries independently adopted similar practices despite their distinct operational contexts, essentially proving that institutional pressures can create convergence even when business models differ dramatically. Implementation examples abound across sectors. Climate risk disclosure creating transparency around environmental impacts, diversity metrics establishing accountability for inclusion commitments, and supply chain transparency extending governance beyond organizational boundaries. Applying institutional theory helps explain this convergence. With normative pressures from professional standards bodies, mimetic responses to uncertainty, and coercive influences from investors and regulators, all driving similar practices. Current research indicates organizations with robust ESG governance access capital at 0.5 to 1.2% lower rates than competitors, essentially confirming that good governance signals create tangible financial advantages. The consistent emergence of these ESG governance approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action, convergent solutions to the universal challenge of demonstrating legitimate operation to stakeholders. Whether you're a manufacturing company reporting on carbon emissions or a service firm disclosing diversity statistics, the fundamental logic remains remarkably consistent. Measure what matters, report transparently, and signal commitment through voluntary disclosure beyond minimum requirements. The acceleration of remote work has created unique challenges for internal governance, particularly in conflict resolution processes now occurring primarily in digital workspaces. It's like traditional workplace disputes, got an upgrade to include screenshots, permanent records, and the ability to accidentally copy the entire company on your angry response. The emergence factors are clear. Remote work acceleration creating physical separation between colleagues, digital interaction becoming the dominant communication mode, and traditional in-person resolution mechanisms suddenly becoming unavailable. The key challenges reveal why digital conflicts require specialized governance approaches. The absence of nonverbal cues increases misinterpretation rates, with 73% of surveyed organizations reporting increased communication conflicts in remote settings. Documentation persistence creates permanent evidence that can extend conflicts beyond their natural lifespan. Cross-cultural communication complications become magnified without contextual cues, and time zone differences affect resolution timing when immediate intervention might be necessary. Governance responses have evolved rapidly to address these challenges. Formalized digital communication guidelines establishing norms for different channels and contexts. Virtual mediation protocols creating structured approaches for online conflict resolution. Asynchronous resolution processes accommodating global team timing differences. And cultural context training helping team members interpret messages across cultural boundaries. What's particularly revealing from an isomorphism perspective is how similar approaches have emerged across different sectors, from corporations to educational institutions, from government agencies to nonprofits, despite their different missions and cultures. Implementation examples demonstrate creative adaptation. Digital ombudsman roles providing neutral third-party mediation in virtual environments, communication platform governance, establishing channel-specific norms and expectations, and digital documentation protocols determining what gets recorded and preserved versus discussed synchronously. Media richness theory helps explain why conflicts escalate more rapidly in digital environments. The reduced information bandwidth of text-based communication creates greater ambiguity and misinterpretation compared to face-to-face interaction. Current research indicates organizations with structured digital conflict protocols report 42% fewer escalated disputes, essentially confirming that intentional governance design can overcome many inherent digital communication challenges. The consistent emergence of these digital conflict resolution approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal challenge of maintaining productive relationships in virtual environments. Whether you're managing a remote corporate team or coordinating a global nonprofit, the fundamental logic remains remarkably consistent. Establish clear digital norms, create structured resolution processes, and compensate for the limitations of virtual communication through intentional governance design. The rapid adoption of automated compliance systems between 2020 and 2025 provides a perfect case study of governance isomorphism in action. Essentially watching diverse organizations independently discover that algorithms can enforce rules more consistently than humans, just with less judgment and occasionally absurd results. The timeline reveals a classic adoption pattern. AI-powered monitoring systems increasing 247% across sectors as organizations sought efficiency in compliance enforcement. Compliance analytics becoming directly integrated with performance management systems. Algorithmic enforcement increasingly replacing human judgment for routine violations, and resistance movements emerging against what employees perceived as dehumanizing automated sanctions. The cross-sector patterns are particularly revealing from an isomorphism perspective. Financial services firms implemented algorithmic trading compliance systems. Healthcare organizations adopted automated privacy violation detection, and government agencies deploy digital ethics monitoring. Fundamentally different organizations with distinct regulatory requirements converging on remarkably similar technological solutions. Privacy implications followed predictable patterns, with expanded workplace surveillance becoming normalized through incremental expansion, from monitoring specific high-risk activities to comprehensive behavioral analysis. The evidence for strategic isomorphism is compelling. Organizations with nothing in common beyond the compliance challenge independently adopted nearly identical automated systems, primarily through mimetic isomorphism, as they copied approaches that appeared successful elsewhere without clear evidence of effectiveness. Emerging countermovements reveal the dialectical nature of governance evolution. Algorithmic accountability advocacy, promoting transparency in automated decision-making. Human-in-the-loop requirements ensuring meaningful oversight of algorithmic enforcement. And proportionality principles, attempting to match consequences to contextual factors that algorithms might miss. This case study demonstrates how technological change accelerates isomorphic processes as organizations facing similar governance challenges rapidly converge on common solutions, essentially reinventing the same enforcement mechanisms through digital means rather than developing fundamentally new approaches to compliance. The result: whether you're a bank, hospital, or government agency, chances are your compliance violations are being detected by remarkably similar algorithms, just with different regulatory frameworks in the background and different consequences when the system flags you for investigation. Our examination of internal governance across diverse organizational contexts reveals clear patterns of strategic isomorphism with significant theoretical and practical implications. It's like discovering that despite their different vocabularies, a crime boss, a national leader, and a tech CEO are all reading from the same rulebook. We've observed all three types of isomorphism identified by DiMaggio and Powell. Coercive isomorphism, where regulatory requirements drive similar governance structures across organizations. Mimetic isomorphism, where organizations copy apparently successful rule systems rather than developing novel approaches. And normative isomorphism, where professional standards create convergent governance practices across otherwise different contexts. The connection to social control theory is particularly illuminating. Universal compliance challenges produce remarkably similar enforcement mechanisms despite profoundly different contexts. Codes, signals, dispute resolution, and sanctions consistently emerge as complementary governance elements. Signaling theory helps explain why mere rule statements prove insufficient, with costly demonstrations of commitment necessary to distinguish genuine adherence from mere lip service. The practical implications are significant for governance design. Leaders can learn valuable approaches from studying apparently unrelated contexts. Your corporation might benefit from understanding how criminal organizations handle norm violations. Understanding isomorphic pressures helps evaluate whether practice adoption represents genuine improvement or mere conformity pressure. And recognizing how digital transformation creates new governance challenges while replicating old patterns can improve technology implementation. This analysis raises important strategic questions for all organizations. When does governance formalization help versus hinder organizational effectiveness? Explicit rules may prevent deviation, but also create rigidity, the organizational equivalent of having so many traffic laws that nobody can actually drive. How can rule systems balance compliance with flexibility? Overly strict enforcement may ensure adherence, but prevent adaptation to changing circumstances. Perhaps most fundamentally, do digital governance tools fundamentally change enforcement dynamics or merely reinvent traditional approaches through new technological means? The evidence suggests more continuity than disruption. essentially digitizing age-old compliance challenges rather than solving them. By understanding the parallel logics that drive governance structures across contexts, leaders can make more informed decisions about which isomorphic pressures to embrace and which to resist, potentially finding novel solutions to age-old governance challenges rather than just copying the same rule systems as everyone else. To conclude our analysis of internal governance across diverse organizational contexts, I'll highlight our key findings. First, governance mechanisms show remarkable convergence despite profound contextual differences, from criminal organizations to government bureaucracies, from political campaigns to tech companies. Fundamentally different entities develop strikingly similar approaches to establishing and enforcing internal rules. It's like discovering that despite their different exteriors, a crime boss and a CEO reach for the same toolkit when trying to maintain internal order. Governance patterns consistently emerge across these contexts. Code systems establishing clear expectations, signaling mechanisms demonstrating commitment, dispute resolution processes handling conflicts, and sanctioning systems enforcing compliance. Understanding isomorphic pressures helps leaders evaluate governance adoption decisions, distinguishing between genuine effectiveness and mere conformity to prevailing trends. Or, as I like to tell my consulting clients, just because everyone else is implementing an AI ethics committee doesn't mean you should. Our key insights illuminate why these patterns persist. Rule systems serve similar functions despite different enforcement mechanisms, because the fundamental challenge of ensuring compliance transcends organizational type or purpose. Digital transformation is reinventing rather than eliminating traditional governance approaches, essentially digitizing enforcement rather than fundamentally rethinking the relationship between rules and behavior. The evidence is compelling. Organizations with structured digital conflict protocols report 42% fewer escalated disputes. AI-powered monitoring systems adoption increased 247% since 2020 as organizations embraced automated compliance enforcement. And organizations balancing punitive and restorative approaches demonstrate 37% greater effectiveness at maintaining compliance. Strategic isomorphism in governance isn't merely an academic curiosity. It's a powerful force shaping how organizations establish and enforce rules, often unconsciously adopting approaches from apparently unrelated contexts that face similar underlying challenges of maintaining internal order. The next time you see a corporate code of conduct, remember you're witnessing the white-collar equivalent of a crime family's honor code. Different packaging. Same function of establishing clear behavioral expectations without constant intervention. Sometimes understanding organizational behavior is simply recognizing that however different the players, the game of rule-making remains remarkably consistent. In our next episode, we'll explore strategic isomorphism, patterns, pressures, and interpretive prudence, synthesizing our findings from the entire series to understand what drives organizational convergence and what it means for organizational effectiveness. If our previous episodes examined specific domains where isomorphism appears, control structures, economic leverage, strategic alliances, and internal governance, our final episode will step back to understand why these patterns emerge consistently across such diverse contexts and what leaders should do about them. We'll integrate evidence from all four domains to identify overarching patterns, examine the theoretical drivers of isomorphism from institutional pressures to universal challenges, and explore the critical tension between beneficial conformity and necessary innovation. From the upcoming 2025 Turkish Academy of Management Conference on Resilience to Williams' framework on balancing legitimacy with adaptation, We'll examine how organizations can navigate isomorphic pressures while maintaining the distinctive capabilities needed for competitive advantage. As you reflect on the organizational patterns we've explored throughout this series, consider these questions. When does following established patterns provide legitimacy and efficiency versus constraining necessary innovation? How do organizations balance the benefits of conformity with the advantages of distinctiveness? What role do different actors play in either reinforcing or challenging isomorphic pressures? This is Kaede, signing off until our final episode when we'll conclude our exploration of strategic isomorphism by examining the big picture of organizational convergence and its implications. Remember that understanding isomorphic pressures isn't merely academic. It provides practical insight into how organizations can make thoughtful choices about which patterns to follow and which to challenge. After all, sometimes the most strategic decision is knowing when to be different in a world pushing you to be the same.